I meant to do that. I have a special connection with that song. I don't think Blake knew that. I think the Spirit did. Okay. So we're going to talk about fasting. We're going to continue this series today. And today we're going to talk about the power of fasting. And specifically, I want to start with this quote. Elmer Towns, last week on Facebook, in our Facebook group, I posted 5 of the sources that I used in preparation for this sermon series. And Elmer Towns wrote one of those sources, Fasting for Spiritual Breakthrough. And in that book, this is one of the things that he writes that really caught my attention. He says, the discipline of fasting has fallen into such widespread disuse that people do not know its power. I want us to focus on that phrase right there, that people do not know its power. Of course, I'm not going to guarantee that every circumstance in your life can be fixed by fasting. I do, however, insist that modern Christians need to take another look at why this classic spiritual discipline has been neglected in our day. And we talked about last week how it has been neglected. It hasn't. Some of us haven't participated in fasting, or I don't want to say don't see the need for it, but a lot of us, I'm including myself in this, the first question that I ask sometimes about anything like this is, am I commanded to do it? And so I just want to, again, begin the discussion for a lot of us about what fasting is, what it represents, and what it can do in our relationship with God as we continue to pursue Him. And so let's return and revisit a little bit of what we did last week. This is the golden circle. We talked about Simon Sinek last week and how he takes this approach with businesses, and so that's the approach he's taking. But I think we can look at it as our lives in general. Most of us, we talked about the why last week. We talked about having that why to come back to. When we're trying to follow through with the what and how, if we don't have that why, then we're not grounded. And if we don't know why we're doing something, eventually we're just probably not going to follow through with it. You have to be grounded in something, and the reason that you're doing it in order to keep reminding you to come back to what it is that you're doing. And the why continues to remind you of the importance and the value of whatever it is you're doing. Specifically for us, we're talking about fasting. And so today, that's where we're going to go. We're going to talk about the what today. And the what is not, okay, so I don't want to talk about what as in the textbook definition of fasting. I mean, we can all, pretty much, anybody can look it up in a dictionary and see what it means. Webster's going to tell you that fasting is, abstaining from all or some food, likely for religious purposes, or often for religious purposes. So that's how it's going to be defined, no matter where you look it up, right? I don't want to look at the textbook definition. I want to go deeper into what it's all about, and take a deeper look at really what the connection is that we're trying to make, and what power can come. I want to focus back on what Towns talks about, that we don't know the power. I want us to understand that fasting is tapping into a power that we desperately need in our lives. All right? So we're going to look at the what today. And in order to do that, we're going to take a look at 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, specifically verses 15 and 16. And I will say, next week, we're going to talk about the how. And I realize up to this point, but I wanted to make this point last week, that we're going to look at different types of fast, not just necessarily food and water, but today we need to get down to what it is, so that next week we can talk about how it looks, how it manifests itself in our lives, right? And how it may look for different folks, right? And so we will talk about that next week. But for this week, we want to tap into what it is at its core, what we're trying to accomplish through the spiritual discipline of fasting at the root, right? So John, in 1 John, in this letter, 1 John, he's addressing people who, he's talking about false doctrine. And a lot of the writings of John go back to this idea that of the false teachers. There were false doctrines being promoted, and John, for the most part, is writing to a group of people who are in danger of being misled by false teachings. And the falsest of all the is falsest even a word? It is now. Of all the teaching that was, I don't want to even use the word significant, but that was the most damaging, I guess, because of the ramifications, the ripple effect that it has. The most damaging was that Jesus is not God. That was being promoted. And so what John is trying to do in this book of 1 John is he's trying to bring people back to truth. He's trying to bring people back to the truth that they have been taught, the truth that they know. And so John, in his writings, that's what he's talking about. He's bringing people back to truth. And this truth that he presents in our reading for today is he warns people not to love the world. Do not love the world, nor the things it offers you, for when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. He says the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. These are not from the Father, but they are from the world. So he said, he tells them, do not love the world or the things it has to offer you, and here's the reason. He doesn't just leave them hanging. He said, because the truth is, the world will sell you on this lie. The world will sell you that in these three ways, the world will sell you on, if you do this, this is how we are satisfied. This is how you achieve fulfillment. That's what the world is going to tell you. In a world that rejects Christ, that's what this world is going to tell you to turn to. At the time, they were promoting the idea that Jesus was not God. And so imagine the ripple effect that has. If Jesus is not God and people buy into that, the ripple effect that it has, there's no resurrection, there's no eternity, there's nothing to look forward to beyond this world. And so this is where we are. And so this is what Shuttlesworth, in his book, I had to write it down, Shuttlesworth, which is one of the books that I had, The Complete Guide to Biblical Fasting. It's one of the sources that I use. He uses, and this is the NIV version of that, all right? We were using the New Living Translation. I'll be honest with you, I like what the NIV, how the NIV words it better, pretty much because that's how I grew up learning it, okay? So the three things that the world promotes, the three things that the world has to offer you, and Shuttlesworth talks about this in his book extensively. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And the truth is, these things don't come from the Father. Okay, so we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at these three things that the world has to offer you, and eventually, we're going to bring this back around to fasting, I promise. We're getting there. But stick with me for a second. Because the things that this world has to offer, they don't come from God. John is reminding everybody of that truth. And so if these things don't come from God, and they only come from the world, and the lie that the world is selling you on is that this is as good as it ever gets, and so you might as well indulge in these three things. If that's the lie that the world is selling you on, and that's what you decide that you want to throw yourself into, that's the only reward you will ever receive. Kind of takes us back to Matthew chapter 6. If you look at how Jesus is talking, we talked about this last week. Jesus is talking about the hypocrites who there's absolutely nothing wrong with the three things that Jesus calls attention to, these three good deeds, as he calls them. He talks about giving, he talks about praying, he talks about fasting. Those are three good things to do, as long as they're done with the right motivation. The problem that Jesus talks about is, in fact, he starts out saying, hey, be careful. Don't be like the Pharisees, these hypocrites, because they don't have the proper motivation for the things they do. Everything is for show. Nothing. These three things that you do should draw you closer to God. That's the intent of those things. Giving, praying, and fasting. These are three good deeds that should draw you closer to God. The only thing they're not seeking to be closer to God. They just want people to praise them for how holy they are. And Jesus says it's the only reward they'll ever get. They'll get it. People will admire them for how holy they are and how righteous they are. But that's the only reward they will ever get. It will not be an eternity. It will be just what this world has to present. Just what this world has to offer. There will be nothing beyond that. And so here's the thing. When we seek these things, when we seek the lust of the flesh and what the world has to offer, the lust of the eye and the pride of life, we can achieve all of these things. We can achieve all of these things. But if that's what we're seeking, that's the only reward we'll ever get. There's nothing beyond that. So let's take a look at these three things, because I think it's important. As I said, Shuttlesworth spends a good bit of time on these things. One of the things he said that I thought was interesting is that lust of the flesh is the first appetite, listen to this, that fights back against you. It's the first appetite that fights back against you. And I will tell you, and we're going to talk about food for a second. I have noticed the later I stay up, the hungrier I get. Anybody else notice that? Okay, I'm going to back off that a little bit, and I'm going to be honest for once, right? I'm not even hungry, okay? It's 10 o'clock at night. I'm watching a game or something. I'm not even hungry. And yet, I've eaten this whole bag of chips. What in the world? Right? I know none of you can relate to this, and that's okay. I'll just be on this island over here. But this idea that I know I shouldn't be snacking. I know this is not good for me. I know this is counterproductive to what I'm trying to accomplish as far as what my doctor tells me I need to accomplish. And so, I know all these things intellectually, and yet, I was going to say the rumble in my tummy tells me something different. It's okay, right? And that's the lust of the flesh. It's a constant battle. It's a constant fight between the two. And I'm always drawn back to this passage in Philippians chapter 3. We read an excerpt as a congregation this morning from Philippians 3. But if you keep on going down in Philippians 3, one of the things that Paul says, he talks about the enemies of the cross of Christ. The enemies of the cross of Christ. So what we're talking about, what he's saying here is not people who, are just don't care about Christ, or, they're just doing their own thing, or they're living, their best life or whatever without Jesus, they are actively preaching against everything that the cross represents. They are actively working against what Jesus represents. And so when Paul talks about this, and as he puts it, he talks about it with tears in his eyes. It moves him to tears. That there are people who actively seek to work against everything that the cross represents and the freedom that it gives us. And he talks about people that destruction is where they're headed. Their God is their appetite. That's the New Living Translation. I'm going to go back to the NIV again. Their God is their stomach. There's just something about what Paul says there. Their God is their stomach. They brag about shameful things, and the only thing they think about, guess what, is life here on earth. Again, we keep going back to this mindset that we look at what the earth, what this world has to offer us from our carnal desire, and we have this mindset, whether we like it or not, that this is as good as it gets. Fundamentally, when we put our stock in what this world has to offer, and that's the beginning and the end of it, that's what we're saying. This is as good as it's ever going to get. That phrase, their God is their stomach. Their God is their appetite. What people who actively work against the cross of Christ, if it feels good, do it. If it makes me feel good, the lust of the flesh, if it fulfills me, if I have an itch and I want to scratch it, I'm going to do it because it satisfies my carnal desire. And I don't care about anything else. When I sit there and I know, hey, look, this is way low on the scale, right? This is a low scale. This is not, in the grander scheme of things, this is not that important. But when I sit there at night watching SportsCenter and I eat an entire bag of chips, I know I'm going to get a lecture from my doctor. But while I'm doing it, I don't care because I've got an itch and I want to scratch it. Because this is as good as it gets. This is what I want to do. I want to do this, and I don't care about the ramifications. If I see it, the lust of the eye, if I see it and I want it, I'll take it. If I see something that I want, I'm just going to take it. That gets us into trouble. Because it absolutely, again, focuses on what the world has to offer. And Shuttlesworth goes on to say that if you take this back to the temptation of Christ, if you take these two things back to the temptation of Christ, in Matthew chapter 4 specifically, if you look at these things, when Jesus, he's been in the wilderness fasting for 40 days, and Matthew even points out he was hungry. And if you look at the first temptation that Satan brings to him, it's turn these stones into bread. Fulfill that desire. Satan's always, here's the thing about our enemy, and this is where we start to get into this idea of the power that fasting can bring to us. Satan's always going to hit you where you're weakest. And he's always going to know where that is. And that may be different for all of us. But he is always going to hit you at your weakest point. And trust me, he knows your weak spot. And he's not just going to try a bunch of stuff and eventually get to it. He's going to hit you where it hurts on the front end. The first thing he says is, the first temptation he brings to Jesus is this idea of pleasuring the flesh, of I'm hungry, I want this, I'm going to take care of my flesh, I'm going to do this. The second thing he brings to him, though, is he shows him all of these kingdoms, all of these things that he's going to give them. And look at all of this that I will give you, right? And again, our enemy does that to us every day. Look at what you're missing. I mean, just look at advertising on TV. There's always, no matter what you have, there's always something better. And the temptation of your eye is always going to be, no matter what I have, there's something else that I'm always going to want. There's something else that I'm always going to crave. And our eyes will get us in trouble, because what ends up happening is that our eyes begin to control us. And we begin to put more faith in what we want and what we desire than in God. And that brings us to a place where we become very prideful. Because the fact of the matter is, if we want something, we can have it. We can pleasure the flesh. We can satisfy our eye. And it brings us to a place of pride, which Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5. He says that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Look at that word, opposes. God opposes everything that pride, that our human pride represents, is directly in contrast to who God is and what He's all about. God is all about humility. And if you don't believe me, look at Christ's life. Look at the life of Christ. Everything that Jesus did reeks of humility. Everything that He did, everything that He modeled reeks of humility. Pride is in, and we keep talking about this idea that opposition, enemies of the cross, things that are working directly against God, things that are working directly in opposition to God. It's not that we're just kind of going through life. It's that these things are directly opposed to who God is and what He's all about. And these things, we succumb to this. We succumb to this because we're human. We succumb to being puffed up, feeling good about ourselves, being proud. We succumb to, I see something, I want it, I'm going to take it. We succumb to pleasuring the flesh, and I want this because it makes me feel good, and I don't care about the repercussions moving forward. Because when we succumb to these things, in essence, what we are saying is, and admitting, is that these things have power over us. We are admitting, and we need to acknowledge that the enemy who is working against us, and might I add, is in direct opposition to God, our enemy who prowls around like a lion seeking to devour all of us, he's stronger than we are. And when we don't acknowledge that, that's what gets us into this kind of trouble. We can't depend on our own power. And why should we? Why should we go through this life trying to defeat an enemy who is more powerful than us all on our own, through our own strength, when we have the power of the living God at our disposal 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? You have the power of the living God at your disposal 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Why are you trying to do everything on your own? What if I told you that fasting is a way to tap into the power of God? What Jesus did when He fasted in the wilderness, He made Himself physically weak, but spiritually, He was as strong as ever because He tapped into the power of the living God. We have the ability to do that. And again, I'm not suggesting that fasting is the only way to tap into that power, but what fasting is at its core, and the way that we tap into that power is we tap into the idea of self-denial, which is in opposition to all of these things. Because what it comes down to, ultimately, what our relationship with God comes down to, and the reason that we get sideways so often is because I want to focus on me. And somehow or another, I always turn the focus back on me. And the message that God continues to send to us is to deny yourself. And fasting, in a lot of ways, is the ultimate self-denial. Because what we are saying to God is, I am denying my most basic human need. I am denying the thing that I crave for the most because I am acknowledging that you are more important to me than anything else. As seekers of Christ, fasting brings us to a place where we set aside every appetite we have. Things that ultimately won't satisfy us, but things that the world is trying to sell us on that will. It's a struggle. Fasting takes us to a place where we are consciously seeking more than fulfilling our carnal desires. We are seeking a God that brings us more fulfillment than we can possibly know or fathom. It's putting aside anything that would distract us from God. It centers us on what's truly important, and this what continues to bring us back to the why. And we are seeking to tap into a power that is greater than ours. What I want you to remember about the what is this. The what of fasting is that we are, for all intents and purposes, acknowledging our lack of power. We are acknowledging that we have an enemy who's working against us and God, who is more powerful than us, and yet we are also acknowledging and celebrating that our God is way more powerful than He is. So if I told you that fasting would allow you to tap into this power in a way that maybe you never have experienced before, would it be something that would at least be worth looking for on the menu? I think that it would. Next week, we're going to talk about kind of what that looks like and how we fast and how that manifests itself in our life. For today, my challenge to you is tap into the power of the living God. Tap into the power of the living God who is at our disposal all the time and is begging us, don't do this alone. Don't try to do this on your own. God will carry you. Let's celebrate that this morning while we stand and sing.